The fingerprint card trembled in Agent McCarthy's hands as he stared at the impossible truth. September 15, 1971, FBI headquarters, Quantico. 30 years of hunting Johnny Roselli had led to this moment, this single piece of evidence that would shatter everything the Bureau thought they knew about organized crime's most elusive figure. The fingerprints belonged to a dead man. Filippo Sacco, age 17, had been officially pronounced dead on September 14, 1922, in a Boston morgue after a drug deal gone wrong in the North End. The coroner's report was clear. Gunshot wound to the chest, massive blood loss, died en route to Massachusetts General Hospital. Case closed, body claimed by family, buried in an unmarked grave in Woodlawn Cemetery. But the man they'd been chasing for 3 decades as Johnny Roselli had those exact same fingerprints. McCarthy reached for his phone with shaking fingers. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity or forged documents. This was something far more sinister, far more impossible. Somehow a dead teenager from Boston's slums had risen from the grave to become the most sophisticated criminal mind in American history. And nobody, not the Chicago outfit, not Hollywood moguls, not even the CIA, had any idea they'd been dealing with a ghost. The investigation that followed would consume the FBI for 7 years and reveal a deception so audacious, so perfectly executed, that it would redefine everything law enforcement thought they knew about criminal identity. But to understand how Filippo Sacco became Johnny Roselli, you have to go back to that blood-soaked night in Boston when a 17-year-old kid made a choice that would echo through 50 years of American crime. September 14, 1922, 11:43 p.m., Boston's North End reeked of fish, sweat, and desperation. The narrow cobblestone streets were slick with recent rain, and the gas lamps cast long shadows that seemed to swallow sound itself. Filippo Sacco crouched behind a stack of fish crates on Commercial Street, his heart hammering against his ribs as footsteps echoed off the warehouse walls. He clutched a canvas bag containing 2 pounds of pure heroin, stolen from Mickey Torino's operation just hours before. At 17, Filippo was already known as one of the smartest street kids in the Italian Quarter, too smart for his own good, his mother used to say. She'd been dead 3 months now, consumption taking her slowly while Filippo watched helplessly, unable to afford the medicine that might have saved her. The footsteps were getting closer. 4 men, maybe 5, their voices carrying that particular edge that meant violence was coming. Filippo had betrayed Mickey Torino, and Torino was the kind of man who made examples of thieves. The kind of man who left bodies floating in Boston Harbor as messages to anyone else considering betrayal. Sacco. The voice boomed through the narrow alley. "We know you're here, you little bastard. Come out and maybe we'll make it quick." Filippo closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the stolen heroin in his hands. 2 pounds worth more than most families in the North End made in a year, enough to buy his way out of Boston, out of poverty, out of the life that had already claimed his mother and would claim him too if he stayed. But first, he had to survive the next 10 minutes. The sound of breaking glass echoed from the far end of the alley. They were searching systematically, overturning crates, checking every hiding spot. Filippo had maybe 30 seconds before they reached his position. He looked down at his blood-stained hands. He'd cut himself on the broken window climbing into Torino's warehouse, and suddenly, impossibly, he smiled, because Filippo Sacco had just figured out how to die. 20 feet away, slumped against the side of a fishmonger's cart, lay another body. Tommy Benedetto, 19 years old, small-time runner who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time when Torino's men started shooting. Tommy was roughly Filippo's size, roughly his age, and in the dim gaslight, they could pass for brothers. Filippo moved quickly, quietly, switching clothes with the corpse. Tommy's blood-soaked jacket, his worn shoes, his wallet containing $17 and identification papers that would never be examined too closely. Most importantly, Tommy's distinguishing scar, a knife mark along his left forearm from a childhood accident. Using the broken glass from the warehouse window, Filippo carefully carved an identical scar into his own arm, biting down on his sleeve to muffle his scream. Blood flowed freely, mixing with Tommy's on the shared clothing. By the time he was finished, the 2 bodies would be nearly indistinguishable in the darkness. Filippo placed his own identification in Tommy's pocket, along with the stolen heroin. Then he did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He picked up the gun that had killed Tommy Benedetto and shot himself in the shoulder, angling the bullet to miss anything vital but create massive dramatic bleeding. The pain was extraordinary, white-hot fire that made him see stars. But the wound was perfect, looked fatal to anyone who wasn't a doctor, bled like a severed artery, but would heal completely with basic medical attention. Filippo collapsed next to Tommy's body, closed his eyes and waited. Torino's men found them 3 minutes later. 2 bodies, both apparently dead from gunshot wounds, blood everywhere. In the chaos and darkness, they didn't look too closely. The one with Filippo's identification papers had the stolen heroin, obviously the thief. The other must have been an unlucky witness. Problem solved. But what they didn't know was that one of those bodies was still breathing. The police arrived at 12:17 a.m., followed by an ambulance at 12:23. Filippo remained unconscious during the entire examination, controlling his breathing through sheer willpower, listening as the coroner pronounced him dead at the scene. They loaded both bodies into the ambulance. Destination Boston City Morgue. It was during the transfer that Filippo made his move. The ambulance was old, poorly maintained, and the back doors had a faulty latch that he'd noticed the moment they closed. As they rounded a corner in Chinatown, traveling at barely 15 miles per hour, Filippo rolled off the stretcher and out the back doors into the night. He hit the pavement hard, tearing open his carefully crafted gunshot wound, but adrenaline carried him to his feet and into the maze of alleys that he'd known since childhood. By morning, the newspapers would report that 2 men had died in a North End shooting. Filippo Sacco, age 17, and an unidentified accomplice, both killed during a robbery gone wrong. Filippo Sacco was officially dead, and in a twisted way he really was. The man who limped away from that Chinatown street was someone new, someone harder, someone who understood that identity was just another tool to be used and discarded when necessary. Within a week, he'd stolen the name Johnny Roselli from a headstone in Mount Auburn Cemetery, the grave of an infant who died in 1892, old enough to have adult identification but young enough that no one would remember him. The transformation wasn't just cosmetic. Filippo Sacco had been a desperate street kid with no future. Johnny Roselli would become something entirely different, charming, sophisticated, deadly intelligent. He practiced his new persona for hours, studying how wealthy men walked, talked, carried themselves. He read newspapers voraciously, memorizing details about the world beyond Boston's tenements. He learned to play poker, to appreciate good whiskey, to speak with the kind of quiet confidence that made people listen. 6 months later, Johnny Roselli stepped off a train in Chicago's Union Station carrying nothing but a stolen suitcase and an entirely fabricated past. To anyone who asked, he was the son of an Italian businessman who died in the 1918 flu pandemic, orphaned young but educated well, looking for opportunities in America's fastest-growing city. It was a perfect story because it was impossible to verify. Thousands of families had been destroyed by the pandemic. Records had been lost. Entire bloodlines had vanished overnight. Johnny Roselli could be anyone, because no one was left to contradict him. Al Capone first noticed him at a high-stakes poker game in the Metropole Hotel. Johnny wasn't the best player at the table, but he was the smartest, reading tells, calculating odds, knowing exactly when to fold and when to bluff. More importantly, he understood something that most street criminals never learned. The most dangerous weapon wasn't a gun or a knife. It was information. "You're not from around here," Capone observed as Johnny collected his winnings from that first night. "Is anyone?" Johnny replied, that easy smile never leaving his face. "We're all from somewhere else, Mr. Capone. The question is whether we're smart enough to become someone new." Capone laughed, recognizing a kindred spirit. Neither man had any idea they were looking at the most successful identity thief in American history. For the next 50 years, Johnny Roselli would build his legend while keeping his secret buried so deeply that even he sometimes forgot where Filippo Sacco ended and Johnny began. But the FBI never stopped looking, never stopped questioning, never stopped pulling on the loose threads that every criminal leaves behind. The investigation that would finally expose him began in 1963, ironically triggered by the very success that Rosselli had worked so hard to achieve. The Bureau was building a massive RICO case against organized crime, and Rosselli's name kept appearing in contexts that didn't quite add up. He was too clean, too smart, too perfectly positioned to be just another mob lieutenant. Agent Dennis McCarthy was assigned to build a complete dossier on Rosselli's background, starting from birth. What he found instead was a trail of breadcrumbs that led nowhere. Birth certificates that had been filed decades after the fact. School records that referenced other school records that didn't exist. Family histories that seemed plausible until you looked closely enough to notice the contradictions. Every document in Johnny Roselli's official biography had been created by Johnny Roselli himself, planted carefully over decades, building a false identity so elaborate that it fooled everyone who came looking. But McCarthy was a different kind of investigator. He didn't just look at what was there, he looked at what wasn't there. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: fingerprints. In 1971, the FBI was transitioning to computerized fingerprint analysis, and as part of that process, they were digitizing old case files, including unsolved murders from the 1920s. A routine check flagged an impossible match between their current surveillance target and a dead teenager from Boston. McCarthy's first thought was that the computer had malfunctioned. Dead men don't age 50 years and become mob bosses in Las Vegas. But the prints were unmistakable, and the implications were staggering. If Johnny Roselli was really Filippo Sacco, then every assumption the Bureau had made about organized crime was wrong. They'd been hunting a ghost. The investigation intensified. Teams of agents descended on Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, every city where Rosselli had operated. They interviewed hundreds of people, analyzed thousands of documents, followed paper trails that stretched back decades. Slowly, the truth began to emerge. In Boston, they found the death certificate for Filippo Sacco, filed by a coroner who'd been paid to ask no questions. In Chicago, they discovered the carefully planted documents that had established Johnny Roselli's false identity. In Las Vegas, they uncovered financial records showing how he'd used his knowledge of identity theft to help other criminals disappear. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source: Rosselli's own arrogance. In 1975, facing Senate testimony about the CIA Castro assassination plots, he'd made a crucial mistake. Trying to establish his patriotic credentials, he'd referenced childhood memories that could only have belonged to Filippo Sacco. He'd talked about watching his mother die of consumption in a North End tenement, about stealing food from pushcarts to survive, about the smell of the fish markets and the sound of Italian being spoken in Boston's Little Italy. Johnny Roselli, the supposed son of a successful businessman, would never have experienced those things. It was a slip that lasted less than 30 seconds, but it gave the FBI the final piece of their puzzle. On November 12, 1975, McCarthy finally confronted Rosselli with the truth. They met in a federal courthouse in Miami, the same city where Rosselli would meet his end just 8 months later. The confrontation was almost anticlimactic: two old men sitting across from each other, discussing a deception that had lasted half a century. "We know who you really are," McCarthy said quietly, sliding the fingerprint comparison across the table. "We know what you did in Boston. We know how you've been playing dead for 53 years. Rosselli studied the documents for a long moment, then looked up with that same easy smile that had charmed presidents and terrified enemies. "You know, Agent McCarthy, the funny thing about death is that it's very liberating. Once you're dead, you can become anyone you want to be." "Why?" McCarthy asked. "Why go to such elaborate lengths? You could have just changed your name legally, started over legitimately." Rosselli's smile faded. "Because legitimate doesn't work for people like me. You think Al Capone would have trusted Johnny Roselli if he knew he was really Filippo Sacco, some dead kid from Boston's gutter? You think the CIA would have recruited him for their Castro operation? You think Harry Cohn would have made him a partner if he knew he was talking to a ghost?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I didn't just change my identity, Agent McCarthy. I changed my entire existence. Filippo Sacco was a victim, a casualty of poverty and circumstance. Johnny Roselli was something else entirely. He was possibility made flesh, and for 50 years that possibility was real enough to fool everyone, including myself." The revelation never made it to trial. 8 months later, Rosselli's dismembered body was found floating in Dumbfoundling Bay, stuffed into a 55-gallon drum. His killers thought they were silencing a mobster who knew too much about CIA operations. They had no idea they were actually disposing of a man who'd been officially dead since 1922. The FBI sealed their findings, classifying the investigation as too sensitive for public release. The truth about Johnny Roselli's identity remained buried in federal archives, known only to a handful of agents who were sworn to secrecy. In death, as in life, Rosselli kept his most important secret. But the implications of his deception extended far beyond organized crime. For 50 years, one of America's most sophisticated criminals had operated under a completely false identity, fooling law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and criminal organizations alike. If Johnny Roselli could successfully fake his death and assume a new identity for half a century, how many other ghosts were walking among the living? The case file on Filippo Sacco/Johnny Roselli sits in a federal archive in Maryland, classified at the highest levels. According to sources familiar with the investigation, it contains evidence of identity theft techniques so advanced that they influenced modern witness protection protocols. The man who died twice had essentially invented the methodology for disappearing in plain sight. Dennis McCarthy retired from the FBI in 1982, haunted by the case that had consumed the final decade of his career. In rare interviews, he described Rosselli as the most successful confidence man in American history, a criminal who'd fooled everyone precisely because he'd fooled himself first. The scariest thing about Johnny Roselli, McCarthy once observed, wasn't that he was a killer or a thief. It was that he was so convincing in his false identity that he actually became that person. Somewhere along the way, Filippo Sacco really did die, and Johnny Roselli really was born. We weren't chasing a man who was pretending to be someone else. We were chasing someone who had literally transformed himself into someone else. Today, law enforcement agencies study the Rosselli case as a masterclass in long-term deception. His techniques for creating and maintaining a false identity have been analyzed by behavioral scientists, identity fraud investigators, and counterintelligence specialists. The consensus is troubling. If one 17-year-old kid from Boston could successfully fake his death and fool the federal government for 50 years, the implications for national security are staggering. The man who died twice proved something that intelligence agencies prefer not to acknowledge. In America, identity is surprisingly fragile. With enough intelligence, patience, and audacity, anyone can become anyone. The question isn't whether it's possible to disappear and assume a new identity. Johnny Roselli proved it was. The question is how many other ghosts are still walking among us, carrying secrets that died with the people they used to be. Filippo Sacco died on September 14, 1922 in a Boston alley. Johnny Roselli died on August 7, 1976 in Miami waters. But the line between those two deaths, the 54 years of perfect deception, represents one of the most audacious criminal achievements in American history. A teenage thief who became a ghost, then became a legend, then became a secret that even death couldn't keep. The man who died twice left behind more than just bodies. He left behind a question that still haunts federal investigators. If Johnny Roselli could fool everyone for 50 years, who else is hiding in plain sight, living borrowed lives, carrying stolen names, walking among us as people they were never meant to be?